Thank you.
Thank you. We don't have, okay, so everyone's here. Good, all of our panelists are here.
Yeah, so we should start.
We're just supposed to... Are we recording? Okay, cool. No. Okay. Welcome, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here, those of you who are in person and everyone else who's online. I'll go ahead and get started by introducing our chair today. Before I do that, I'm Rana. I'm a PhD student here at SOAS, and I also work as a policy researcher with SOAS ICOP. It's an independently funded project. It stands for the Influencing Corridors of Power project here, and we aim to connect, sort of propagate civic engagement, but also connect people with parliament and parliamentarians through one-page policy briefings. So I'll introduce Professor Lutz. Professor Lutz is a professor of international human rights law here at SOAS. He's the core director of the SOAS Center for Human Rights Law. He's also the co-author with a number of Sudanese authors, such as Professor Muhammad Abdussalam Babikr. He authored in the International Human Rights Law and Practice book published by Cambridge University Press, and he is also the co-editor of the Constitution Making and Human Rights in the Sudans, published in 2019. I'll leave it with you. Thank you so much for chairing. And
Yes, thank you very much, Rana, for the kind introduction, and welcome to all of you who have been able to join us here in person and online tonight for today's panel, Accountability, Legal Mechanisms and the Politicization of Human Rights Discourse, the Case of Sudan. So obviously today's discussion will focus heavily on developments since the revolution started, the transition and the coup, and looking beyond that. But I think it's also important to take a broader view and remind ourselves when we talk about human rights in Sudan that it has a long trajectory. And in terms of the human rights work on that even predates the Bashir regime that incidentally also came to power by way of a coup in 1989. So one of the first reports I'm aware of on human rights abuse in Sudan was the Dain massacre, slavery in the Sudan, and the authors were Shari Ahmed Mahmoud and Suleiman Ali Baldo, who's still very well-known activist and commentator. And that report is available online. It's well worth looking up, setting out very clearly the dynamics behind some of the issues at the time. And what is perhaps slightly depressing is that a lot of the structural factors and patterns they identified those days are still in evidence today. So I think we would do well to look at the human rights issues in a longer durée, and I think that will be reflected throughout the contributions by the panelists today, and hopefully also in the discussion to come later on. I actually read you a brief poem I wrote. Not that I would call myself a poet, but I dabbled a bit in poetry inspired by some of my travels in Sudan. And that was in 2008, I think, when I wrote that. It's called Hope. So the children of years of suffocation are coming of age, seizing the moment, treating those who suffered rape, taking up cases of those who have been wronged, speaking out for peace and democracy. The old guard is wondering and hoping that someone will finally break the seemingly endless cycle. So obviously that was in 2008, and a decade or so later, those dreams seemingly had come true. Again, I think it's important to recognize that the revolution has been long in coming. And obviously I'm not saying it's a human rights revolution, but human rights and the human rights movement certainly played their part. And a lot of that work is really quite remarkable. And for anyone who is surprised by the level of commitment, determination, and ingenuity of the revolutionaries in Sudan, they would do well to look at social movements and human rights organizations and how they had developed over the years in Sudan. So again, a plea for perhaps sort of this broader historical focus. I'll leave it at that by way of introduction. We have three great panelists with us today. One, the first in the series of Sudan seminar series, actually in person with us, is Mariana Goetz, and the two other speakers we have who will join us online is Mohamed Osman and Wallah Salah. So I will introduce each of them before they speak, and I'll begin with Mariana. She's the director of Rights for Peace, has over 20 years of experience in post-conflict justice, including at the Rwanda Tribunal and the Special Court for Sierra Leone, where she was a legal advisor. She was also the head of programs at Aegis Trust and the former deputy director at Redress, where, as it happens, we were actually colleagues. So it's perhaps a small world in the London-based human rights scene. She has done quite a lot of work with Rights for Peace on Sudan, recently producing a number of reports such as on hate speech, narratives, and the role of women's rights defenders. Is of course actively following also developments surrounding the ICC case. Mariana has worked a lot on the ICC from its very inception, one can say, and with victims' rights movement, and will also situate developments in Sudan in the broader human rights discourse internationally. So I'm really looking forward to your presentation. Mariana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lutz, and thank you for organizing this event. It's really nice to be at an in-person event after these years of engaging online. First of all, I'm really honored to be included on this panel because I am not Sudanese, and Sudan's history and culture and activism is so rich and so elaborate that one always feels slightly at awe on a panel with other Sudanese activists. So I'm just going to give my 2 cents worth from the work we've been doing at Rights for Peace, and perhaps start with a few little words about Rights for Peace. We're a pretty new organization, established just before COVID, actually, in 2019, really to try and fill a gap in relation to prevention from a human rights perspective. There's a lot of attention that goes on accountability, and we feel that really not enough on prevention. Of course, it's much more difficult to show impact for prevention because obviously proving you've prevented something is more difficult than showing that you've achieved something. So it's a difficult area to break into, but I think we are making inroads, and we have 2 program areas. One is on countering discrimination and identity violence. And there we're really working on resilience and also law reform before the coup. The other program areas on victims' justice, in particular victims' rights to reparation and the linkages with prevention and guarantees of non-repetition, etc., for those who are familiar. In terms of the recent reports that was mentioning regarding Sudan, the first one we produced in 2021 was looking at discrimination and hate speech and how this was fueling continued violence in spite of the transition, or perhaps as kind of part and parcel of the transition. And the second one, more recent, is really looking at the hate narrative since the coup, and in particular a focus on hate narratives against women human rights defenders. So when thinking about the title, in particular the politicization of the human rights discourse, I really wondered how you could separate human rights discourse from politics. I mean, for me, it's inherently political, and in Sudan, it is so much the case, given the long history of activism and of attempts to achieve democracy. So perhaps my thinking was, well, perhaps more one can look at feminization of the human rights discourse and how that has changed, though I think women have been at the forefront of activism for a long, long time, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But in terms of today's focus, I'll mention just briefly just the general lack of focus on the conflict regions. We feel that this is something that was ongoing before the transition, during the transition, and since. I think it's very much part of the narrative of division in Sudan in terms of the center and peripheries that a lot of people have talked and written about. And this is no less today, particularly when it comes to mass atrocity prevention. The second area in terms of the hate narrative, so I'll just kind of give a brief overview of how we see those have developed, and in particular talking about women's role and also the backlash against women activists as part of those, a part of their role in the pro-democracy and the revolution. And yeah, finally, just the increased brutality against and hate against women human rights defenders. So first of all, our 2001 report sought to address several gaps. We felt that there was a lack of attention on the violence and absence of rule of law in the conflict regions since the revolution. There was a prevalence and escalation of hate narratives that were really feeding into a volatile landscape. So while there was a lot of attention on the transition process and on a lot of developments that were going on in Khartoum, violence was continuing in the regions as before, and the landscape seemed to be even more volatile, if you like, in a way, because a sort of gap of a sort of vacuum of power, perhaps, or general lack of rule of law in the regions, including Darfur and South Kordofan and Blue Nile in particular, but also actually in the east of Sudan as well. This is something that we saw, an escalation of hate narratives and divisive language. For the first time really ever, we saw quite significant violence in the east of Sudan, in Port Sudan, for instance, and places within the region. We also felt that there was just a lack of understanding from the international actors about how these hate narratives really were just a continuation of the bias that underlied the genocide, and that this was just a continuation, and that there sort of seemed to be a disconnect of this idea that there was sort of these conflict regions, but not really understanding that this all stems from racism, that is the underlying factor of what was the genocide, this genocidal intent. I mean, what was it about? It was about racism and ethnic division. Also about resources and other things, but that there seemed to be for us a big disconnect in that understanding. So during the transition, of course, there were some really important developments. The constitutional charter of the transition period, and there were some specific provisions relating to discrimination. There was a real sense of needing to address discrimination as an underlying cause of the conflicts. there was a new the Bill of Rights was replaced by the new Rights and Freedoms Charter, which was Chapter 14 of the Constitutional Charter. So there was, some improvements there as well. There was also a dissolution of the National Congress Party. So these were sort of perhaps the more political aspects. And in terms of law reforms, I think there's been a lot of coverage of the changes that happened during the transition period. There were a number of public order laws that were repealed. The Apostasy Law, which was the repealing of that law received quite a lot of attention. This was a law where previously the death penalty was included for renunciation of religious beliefs. And also there were a number of criminal code amendments, no longer requiring women to obtain permission from male relatives to travel with their children, allowing non-Muslims to consume alcohol in private, the ending of public flogging, and criminalization of FGM. So perhaps it's quite easy to critique the transitional period. I think, as academics always wanting to critique things, it is quite easy, and I think in a sense when we talk to people who were actively engaged with the process, there was generally a feeling of lack of expertise, like a whole generation of human rights activists had, been lost, had, left the country and were, needed to return, and that, there were a lot of battles being fought on numerous fronts simultaneously. So there was a general sense of being overstretched, and also constant political tensions within and outside the freedoms of forces and change. Perhaps some of the critiques that maybe we could make of the transition period, I know Lutz was interested in some of the lessons learned, was that there was this historic and deep discrimination just wasn't really being kind of put to the forefront of debates. The issues that concern the peripheries were not also prioritized in terms of the rule of law and discrimination. There were a number of protests during the transition period about discrimination, about the lack of law, rule of law, the discriminatory law enforcement there was in the regions. For instance, an example that something that we were working on at the time was there was a draft anti-discrimination bill, but the concerned groups were never consulted or informed even about the process of reform of this anti-discrimination or drafting of an anti-discrimination bill. For us, we felt that the transition was an opportunity to engage with discriminated groups, with minority groups in different regions, in order to counter the divisions between the center and the periphery, as an opportunity really to move forward together. But that was not felt. So in the regions, it was still felt that this was like Khartoum-led, and that that those who were really discriminated against were still discriminated against. They were not part of those kind of discussions on law reform. Also, there was no consideration of discrimination against women or LGBT rights or any other issues. The anti-discrimination, the two drafts that were circulated only really considered ethnic division and race. So that was for us an opportunity that was missed. In a sense, you almost needed to have some kind of truth and reconciliation process where you would have some reckoning about discrimination and division in the past that could be inclusive. The reaction, in a way, of the regime sympathizers and former regime loyalists and extremists during the transition was really that this was an attack on the National Congress Party, on Islamist values, and on Sharia law. Also a threat to sovereignty, because there was a cooperation agreement with the International Criminal Court that was signed. There was imminent talk of transfers of those who had been indicted by the ICC, etc. And counter-protests started to emerge. Now, something that's really interesting is obviously the use of social media to influence public opinion. And we see that just before the coup in September, this is a notice from Facebook, actually, they identified both Iran and Sudan at that time as countries where there was a significant influence operation that was going on. Actually, when you go through the report, it looks like the operation was manned from the outside of Sudan, not from within. So maybe some consultants outside, et cetera, had been contracted. When you go through these Facebook reports, they're quite interesting because you see, which companies, have been identified as promoting these kind of influence operations. There was one famous one in Israel who was, undertaking influencing operations on Facebook, in Nigeria and a number of African countries. Sudan wasn't one of them. But anyway, it just shows how that kind of mechanism works. We know well from our own politics here in the UK with Brexit, etc., and some of the way in which public relations companies can be hired to undertake these kind of campaigns. So for Sudan, just before the coup, just a month earlier in September last year, there was 116 pages were removed, 666 Facebook accounts and 69 groups and 92 Instagram accounts in Sudan that were all removed, and that they found that these were linked to the Sudanese Rapid Support Forces, which is a paramilitary group operated by the Sudanese government. This is literally a screenshot from the Facebook report, which doesn't mince its words as to where it thinks it's coming from. So that's quite interesting to see that actually there was quite a big push for a counter narrative to be developed. So this is where we get this counter narrative. I don't know if you remember, just before the coup, there were all these protests about these anti-democracy protesters, and you're like, who, what? So there were protests that were taking place of those who were apparently against the revolution and against the pro-democracy movement, so this was, a kind of backlash, if you like, of the more extreme views and more conservative views in Sudan. So there was a sense really that women should return to their traditional roles and spaces. And so here I'm just going to kind of highlight really how this backlash, how this kind of counter narrative emerged or was played out in relation to the role of women in the pro-democracy movement and after the coup. I mean, there are a lot of quotes you find and slogans around women, and that, this revolution is a women's revolution is one that is a common slogan and quote. Also, the statistics show that women organized, led, and participated in the protests in really high numbers. Up to 70% of protesters across the country were women. And also, I just wanted to echo what Lutz was saying earlier, that actually this kind of engagement isn't new, and it isn't new for women either, that from anti-colonial times, from anti-colonial uprisings against British rule to the overthrow of the first military regime in 1964, to the overthrow of the military regime in 1985, Sudanese women have been at the forefront of social and political calls for change. So there is a long tradition and history of that. Here I just wanted to show a picture of, the image we have maybe of Sudanese women protesters are perhaps, veiled and old-fashioned. They're right up there with their tattoos and activism. Can we say really that the backlash against women human rights defenders became more specific or more brutal post-coup? We started to look at it in particular at that time, so our second report really focuses in on this, and we have a number of case studies that we've put in there about specific incidences. There are countless incidences of widespread sexual violence against women already at the sit-in that we're all familiar with, the sit-in that was part of the revolution. And even before that, so the first incident, I guess, in terms of the revolution was the 19th of December, 2019, where there were at least 13 reports of gang rape against protesters. So that was, before actually the overthrow of Bashir and the regime. And then you have the 3rd of June, which is also very well known, documented in terms of the amount of sexual violence that took place that has been documented against protesters at that famous sit-in. But what has happened then since the coup? So in a way, this isn't a new phenomenon, the use of women's bodies as a kind of political tool to silence and close up the civic space. In my view, it's something that is just continued and that has become perhaps more pronounced and become perhaps more systematized. It's now just de rigueur, it's just constant. There's one quote that we have in our report, which I've titled there, "If those men don't rape you." So that was a post in Facebook that was widely liked and circulated and had a lot of followers. This was actually written by a university professor, and the full name of the person and department, etc., is in the report. And it was just before the Women's March on 23rd of December last year. So that was a march that was organized to commemorate the sexual violence that had taken place in 2019 as part of the revolution. And so this Facebook post was really interpreted as an incitement to repeat the violence again at this commemoration event. Perhaps also what's interesting, some writers have been discussing this kind of mentality and the sort of counter narrative, if you like, that's coming back as a backlash against the progress that was done during the transition, talking about public order as becoming a mentality. So this, that's just this kind of attitude that women should go back to their spaces and their traditional roles. And that, so this journalist, Reem Abbas, has said that even with the repealing of the public order laws, public order has become a mentality, and that to bring about true change alongside more legal reforms at the societal level, there needs to be sustained efforts in improving school curriculums and countering fundamentalist propaganda. So there's this real sense that there's a tension there with the old guard and the mentality of public law and order still being there. So yeah, we see lots of posts about name calling women activists, trying to ruin their reputation and calling them loose. All these kinds of names that are used, and that there is a need for a return to law and order to combat so-called debauchery. Here is one here about, this is a woman who is a singer, and this is the Facebook post, talks about these promiscuous, trashy singers and loose women, etc., and basically saying at the bottom, you would be best to arrest these trashy, this trashy loose singer immediately. So there's this real, narrative that's in social media, and it's not just in social media; it's actually acted out. I mean, there are countless, and also in our report we document, the large number of gang rapes that take place in the margins of protests. Oops. So there's something wrong with my slide here. I think I have the picture twice. So since the let's see if I, oops, oh no, now I've really messed things up. So since the coup, perhaps also we could say that there's a lack of international attention. There was initially, some there was initially, a special session at the Human Rights Council that looked at the situation, but in a sense, there was a bit of I feel, normalization from the international community, and also a sense that the situation of Sudan has sort of been subsumed in other world crises like the war in Ukraine, and in a way, there hasn't been a huge amount of coverage. There's been probably more coverage of the flooding in Sudan than the human rights violations, I would say, in recent months. So that's all from me. Also, perhaps the last point is that there really is also very little linkage that's being made between the conflict in the regions and the atrocities that are ongoing in Darfur and the conflict in Ukraine. And actually, there are some very important links there. I didn't know that actually Sudan is the third largest gold exporter in the world. And actually a lot of those gold mines are now being operated by the Wagner Group, which is the same group that is being used, for the Donbass region as a sort of militia, if you like, and that is apparently, I think yesterday, I saw on Al Jazeera, owned by Prigozhin, the foreign minister. So there seems to be a lack of reports. You'd think, where are all those reports that that we've seen in other conflicts, like in Sierra Leone about conflict diamonds, etc., that link these things. Though, so you sort of see in passing articles, maybe there was one in the Washington Post about saying how the ruble had been stabilized by the intervention of this Wagner group in Sudan, and the gold mining was linked to that. But, experts need to be called in to look at these things in more detail. So that's it from me. Don't know about my time, whether I've taken over too long.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mariana. That also, I think the note you ended on actually links very well back to discussions we had last week on journalism on Sudan, especially sort of international coverage failing to go into that level of detail and bringing out the connections. So I think that is something of concern, of course, because there have been numerous very good policy reports and NGO reports, and it's not for a want of documentation and analysis, so it could easily be reported on much better than it is. Next, it's my great pleasure to welcome Mohammed Osman. He's a researcher in the Human Rights Watch Africa division, and he joined the organization in late 2018 and now covers Sudan. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, he was with the Open Society Justice Initiative in New York, working on corruption and advocacy. And his career background is that he started as a practicing lawyer in Sudan, and he also worked as a legal advisor to Redress and the Sudan Human Rights Monitor on torture and ill treatment, and has also worked as a legal advisor for the ICC delegation in Sudan. So Mohammed brings a wealth of experience with him to discuss the failure of accountability as a political project during the transition. That will be the main focus of his talk, and he will also, following up on something that Mariana already raised, discuss a bit targeted sanctions as a means to bring about greater human rights protection. So without further ado, Mohammed, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Lutz, and greetings for everyone. It's definitely a pleasure to be at the panel, and hopefully we could have a good discussion for today. I actually would like to intend to have a different intro to the conversation, something Professor Lutz started with when he mentioned the massacre of Aden. And it's actually going back in Sudan's history. In basically 1956, just weeks after independence, we had the huge massacre of Yoda in Kosti, which is a long story, but basically a lot of it related to land disputes and working conditions of farmers in White Nile State. There is an ethnic dimension into it. Over 100+ persons were killed accordingly. And then when you read, there was an interesting old article about it. It's called The Black Hole of Kosti. And when you read the communication that's been happening between the authorities in Kosti and the authorities of Khartoum, one thing stands particularly interesting if you want to read the dynamics of the transition, which is basically the attention that the government made to ensure that the news about the massacre wouldn't go out of proportion, because there was a big visit of the US government and the UN delegation to allow Sudan to get funds after independence. And this is one of the issues, I think, if you're looking into the failure of accountability as a political project, because I think from the different discussions I had in Khartoum, with the former government officials or other actors, it was clearly an issue of political will. And I would like to break down to, in terms of what happened and what went wrong with that. But one of the issues is that the the former government, and I know, of course, right, it's quite easy to be critical about it, but the former government, I mean, both sides, as well the international donors, did not really see accountability as a political priority. And I think that was evidently seen not only in the outputs and the outcomes and the results, but also the resources dedicated to accountability. Because at the end of the day, accountability is a resource consuming project, but the way it was done, the way it has been, and just some reflections we could have post-coup, we could understand why was not really going into the right direction. And basically, since the transition, there was two main modalities of accountability happening in Sudan. I mean, based after the formation of the transitional government in 2019, the main focus was on the investigation around the June 3rd dispersal in Khartoum of the sit-in. But I would like to touch upon other modalities before coming to that, one specific example. I was in Khartoum just weeks before the coup last year, and had a lot of discussions with lawyers, prosecutors, and government officials, families of martyrs and survivors of the different atrocities in Sudan. And it strikes me how these two distinct modalities took place, and also the outputs they delivered. So one modality is, which is by far was the massive thing that we saw through the last years, is investigative committees. And anyone who familiar with the Sudan context know how much we do like making committees, and unfortunately results always the same, almost zero. And the thing is, with these investigative committees, they were all formed under the authority of the Attorney General, being given all of them actually are being given prosecutorial powers. The combination was quite interesting because basically with investigative committees, you have prosecutors. But what happened is that the Attorney General, for different reasons, decided to combine individual well-known human rights lawyers with prosecutors. And then the other modality is what I could call like ad hoc prosecutors. The interesting thing that I think we basically, the last 3 years, we had like between 15 to 20, maybe even more, investigation committee into very different series of past abuses. I mean, we had one on the June 3rd, but we had one on the September 2013, we had one on Darfur. We had a couple of committees dedicated to very specific cases around extrajudicial killings. But none of them managed to actually bring the case to a trial. And I think only one of these committees managed more or less to do a little bit of progress on one or two cases of protesters' killings in 2018, 2019. The 99% of cases that actually moved to trial in Khartoum and other places was actually done by prosecutors. And that's the interesting thing here, because these prosecutors engage with these cases just out of their own passionate work on the cases, but also with the support of families, witnesses, resistance committee members. So what we ended up having is an accountability process that taken and funded by victims themselves. There was almost no funding or support from government, the former government, into the accountability efforts. So however, we ended up with some cases moved to trial. Of course, now we saw a setback in one of the cases that involved an RSF officer called a protester in 2019, who being released by an order of the High Court. And that's something I'm happy to talk more about in the discussion later. But so basically, if there is one of the lessons learned we need to look at is to avoid the modalities that we had, in particular the investigative committees. And the important thing here to do is to actually have a strategy around accountability. And this is the political part of it, because strategy is not, legal reform, only institutional reform. It is also the political decision to allow resources, the political decision to come to donors and say, we need fund, we need support to these things. And what we saw that, officials were not really interested to come forward with these demands. And most of the donors, to be honest, were not even interested to come and, they would say, put some pressure on the government to put them in a hard place. So there was a lot of political calculations to avoid what they seem to be a conflict with the military and to delay accountability to take place after an elected government, get hold, and the coup happened at the end of the day. But looking now, I mean, one of the things that as Human Rights Watch been looking at since the coup, beside the continuation of accountability, the failure of accountability, is the way we are seeing suppression of the protest movement now. And because, we're not talking about individual officers or officials who, commit abuses, we're talking about what we could describe as a tactical repression. And I'm saying tactical because A, it's intentional, and B, it's done in a way to ensure targeting active members in the movement by way of killing, by way of injuring, by way of arresting. So we are seeing the failure of not only accountability, but also, and I know probably my colleague will talk about, the failure of security sector reform in display, because we have the same abusive forces that there was a chance to tame them and rein them in, did not happen. And we're seeing them now having a carte blanche into committing abuses. We're seeing it in the way these forces are deployed. I mean, there are multiple forces being deployed. There's changes of forces, make it even more confusing for monitors to identify, forces responsible for abuses, but most importantly, the chain of command. And that's something I'd want to address when I talk about the targeted sanction. But the other point, the other part of our work, and I think it's really crucial, like my colleague Mariana mentioned the lack of international attention following Ukraine, but there is significant lack of attention has been happening on Darfur since 2019. And that's just goes against all the documented level of abuse that's been taking place. So basically, for example, in West Darfur region alone, between January and now, we have over 300 plus persons being killed, hundreds of thousands being displaced. There are worrying trends of abuses taking place in Darfur, and these are not the same dynamics we've seen in the Darfur conflict in the early stages. We're seeing it because it's pretty much influenced by the lack of accountability and the lack of security sector reform, but more importantly, also the lack of political will to deliver a long-lasting peace. It also touches upon the issue around inclusiveness, that for sure is part of the issues we saw around the legal reform. We're also seeing it in the Juba Peace Agreement, because it also failed so far to deliver, either peace or accountability at the end of the day. And the fact that what we're seeing now with the coup represent a high level of this tactical suppression. We're seeing this backtracking on the little gains of the transition. I mean, going through the few lists of the legal reform that happened, they were fine, but they were also quite cosmetic in their essence. But even though we're seeing backtracking happen, which is going to be even more difficult to restart the process by allowing the military to consolidate power every day. And this is why targeted sanction conversation comes quite important, because one of the things with targeted sanctions, and that's the position of many people probably I talked with, it needs not to be introduced as a trade-off to accountability. Accountability needs to take place. The idea behind targeted sanctions has to come hand in hand with theory of change. Like, you need to deliver targeted measures that target specifically people on the top of the command chain. Because one of the things, as I mentioned, that many people would not understand, who is commanding this force and what. I mean, we saw the designation of the Central Reserve Police, I think in March, and it didn't really do anything on the ground. So what you need to do is targeting individuals who have a high level of power, who will actually feel the harm of these measures, not only small commanders or small units on the ground. And at the end of the day, targeted sanction has to come with a package. And this package is political. And it's political because international actors need to understand that going again through the track of the 2019 constitutional agreement will not go anywhere. And I know there is this conversation happening now with the draft proposal presented by the Sudan Bar Association. I think the dangers behind it, at least from what I heard, is also the same issues around inclusivity. The Sudan problem is not a matter of making constitutions, it's a matter of constitutionalism. And it's very important for the different actors at the moment to understand that without accountability, you cannot go anywhere. What you can end up doing is delaying another coup, delaying another catastrophe happening in Sudan. And this is why citizens committees in their political charters, I think, remarkably pointed accountability and justice as a crucial element of whatever transition to come in the future. And yeah, so I think I would like to just stop here and give the floor to my colleague Ola, but I'm looking forward to the discussions, the questions that will come later.
I think only because Mohammed is online, he doesn't mean he should be deprived of a round of applause from us here as well, because I think it was a very clear and succinct and compelling argument you made. So thank you very much for that, Mohammed. And now it's my great pleasure to turn to you, Wala. It's Wala Salash. Is a Sudanese human rights monitor and lawyer based in Khartoum, and she has over a decade of experience working on issues of legal reform, documentation of human rights violations, and advocacy with a focus on women and crackdown on dissent. So very much along the lines of the issues we've already covered, and I think especially your focus on documentation, law reform and women's rights is obviously put you in, if you like, pole position to work on these issues during the transitional period. And I think it's a great opportunity now for all of us to hear further from you about your work and your analysis of regional and international advocacy prior to the revolution and since then, and to ask some critical questions about law reform, legislative processes, and maybe also some of the failures, because we've already heard from Mohammed about failures in what he called the accountability as a political project, but here also there are a number of other, if you like, rule of law, law reform and human rights projects alongside it, and you're obviously very well placed to enlighten us on what you see as the key challenges and perhaps also solutions in that regard. So, Anna, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Lutz, and thank you, everyone. My presentation will focus broadly on the political landscape and making the argument that the current situation in Sudan is a result of a series and sequence of failures, mistakes, but also, here and there some efforts. So I will start by saying that any human rights related issue, especially where it comes to human rights in conflict and post-conflict context, so tightly linked to the political landscape, right? And I would like to read the complex human rights agenda in Sudan based on the political context that produced it, right? Prior to the revolution and post the revolution, especially during the transitional period. And maybe I will use 2011 as a key time to look at the shifts in the political landscape in Sudan, prior to the independence of South Sudan and after the independence of South Sudan, but before the revolution. And if you look at the situation before 2011, you would note that, I make the point that that it's important to critically assess the role of both the Sudanese human rights movement inside the country and the regional and international actors and their approach toward the human rights issues to understand the current situation. So before 2011, there was two areas of focus, right? The first area, sorry. Sorry for that. The first area of focus is actually the ongoing civil war and conflict in South Sudan until 2005, but also Darfur that started in 2003, and the other side of the coin is the human rights violations that were based on Sharia law. And in that, I think both national, international movement used an approach that can be described as a cry for help. The list of examples are long, cases of public lashing or public flogging, going viral, international mobilization against flogging, but then way less attention to where this is coming from, and the broader legal framework that govern these incidents or high-profile cases. It's important also to focus on the fact that after 2011, a new term started to increasingly be used, which is the Sudan fatigue, especially internationally, which is, for regional international actors, as a result of this Sudan fatigue, have shown disinterest in Sudan in many ways, including by supporting actually avenues for peace through mechanisms that were clearly from the beginning would not achieve peace and would only contribute in elongating the life of the former regime. One example one can give is the AU's high-level implementation panel on Sudan, headed by the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, and then we can go further after that period, which is another large issue, which was the increase of the discourse around immigration and refugees in Europe, that also pushed the Europeans to engage more constructively with Khartoum. Including, the Khartoum process, which is a collaboration between the EU and different governments in the region to keep refugees in their respective countries, which by looking at the nature of the governments in the region, one can interpret the agreement as a green light to move for more violations against citizens and refugees. It was amid the Sudan fatigue and these, back and forth, constructive engagement with the former regime that actually the Sudanese people around Sudan's 18 states managed to topple the presidency of Omar al-Bashir. By that time, the regional and international actors started to reprioritize Sudan. You see more funding, more focus, more attention is paid to Sudan. And to prioritize a country after a fatigue, it required more and deeper context analysis and understanding exercises that I do believe regional and international actors were not either ready or willing to conduct. And that was shown in different examples on how the period after toppling al-Bashir was managed and the reactions around that. I make the observation that the international community was more optimistic about the transitional arrangements than most of the Sudanese people. The political landscape in Sudan since the political agreement between the FFC, the Freedom Forces for Freedom and Change, and the Transitional Military Council was loaded with a large elephant in the room, which is justice. The agreement was not, as it repeatedly presented, a response to the slogans of the Sudanese people of freedom, peace, and justice. It came despite these demands for freedom, peace, and justice. A quick look at the performance of the much celebrated partnership at the time between the military and the civilian components of the transitional government before the coup can testify to what I just said. And we have to also reflect on the time when the revolution started, by the time Bashir was toppled, Sudan was in deep economic crisis, as it's in deeper economic crisis now, but at the time it was seen to be, the bottom of the bottom. And Bashir, in his last years, worked tirelessly to reach a compromise with the United States government to lift the sanctions and Sudan's name from the state-sponsored terrorism list, which, if succeeded, would pave the way to re-engagement with international monetary institution, IMF and the World Bank. And actually, Bashir succeeded in lifting the sanctions, and only the SST delisting was remaining by the time he was toppled. The transitional government did not drift from the overall policies, economic policies of al-Bashir and his vision to the way the situation would improve, former Prime Ministers Hamdok's first and most important priority was to re-establish the relationship with the international community. And indeed, Sudan was delisted and subsequently deemed eligible for debt relief. And without going into details on why this approach is problematic, Bashir and Hamdok's approach, which is very similar, is problematic. It was in this context that most of the legal reform took place. And that's why most of the changes that took place seemed, at least for us as practitioners inside the country, that they were outside looking rather than inside looking. It was to fulfill commitments to the international community rather than to the Sudanese people. And because of the infrastructure of governance in the country was never completed, meaning that the transitional legislative council was never formed. Only 2 of the 11 commissions that were stated in the constitutional document were established, and these 2 were the 2 commissions under the supervision of the Sovereign Council / the military, and they were done and they were formed in an untransparent and unconsultative manner. But then most of the other commissions, the Human Rights Commission, the Gender Equality Commission, the Land Commission, all these commissions were not formed. With a very, reduced voice of criticism towards the fact that, you cannot recreate a just process and reform process without a democratic landscape and consultation with citizens. So this context created a government that was accountable only to its international partners, but not to its people. And I will just give one or two examples, mainly driven from the reform that was, or the legal changes that were done in 2020, July 2020, which included, the criminalization of FGM and the reducing, not abolishing, public flogging, because it was only reduced to al-hudud crimes, so non-al-hudud crimes, that you won't get flogged for, but other crimes you can. And the article on consumption of alcohol and so on and so forth. They were mainly celebrated, despite the fact that many of these changes were far from sufficient to create actual change. And let's get one example, which is the alcohol consumption article, which allowed non-Muslims to deal with alcohol while Muslims cannot. The article mainly meant that only the consumers, the non-Muslim consumers, are not criminalized. But if you look at the landscape of, who are the alcohol borrowers in Sudan, mainly women in the informal sector, where majority of them are either South Sudanese refugees or IDP women. Those are not protected by this article because they sell to Muslims, because the consumers are mainly Muslims, and because also the Muslim and non-Muslim in Sudan it's a very tricky thing, because if your ID does not show, and our IDs do not show our religion, It means that you're going to ethnically profile people before judging whether they violated the alcohol consumption article or not. You know, and I would just, I know we went very long, so I will shorten. I would just conclude by saying that there is a term that widely used currently, that the coup, the military coup of October 2021 has blocked important positive reforms by the civilian component of the transitional government. And I asked the question, has the situation actually deteriorated after the coup? Indeed, it has. But it's not a deterioration that's coming from a change of the nature of the state or of the legal powers that are given to state actors to violate human rights, to violate human rights, but rather a deterioration in terms of the scale. But it's legally protected, unfortunately, within the domestic laws. And this last thing I would say, that the situation in Sudan since April 2019 coup, not October 2021, because I do believe that October 2021, as well as the political arrangement that was done in the middle, were an extension of the first military coup that took place on 11 and 12 April 2019, has been about learning an old lesson, unfortunately, which is it's impossible to reach peace without justice. And I echo what Mohammed Osman said earlier, that accountability was never a priority. And it was very difficult to be a priority, looking at the political process that led to the formation of the transitional government and the sustainability of its work until the coup. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Awala, for this really engaging presentation and obviously scathing critique, if you like, of the nature of not only the international engagement, but also of how, if you like, the transitional government has focused on outward-looking superficial engagement rather than a more profound transformation. And I was really sort of listening to you. I recalled a lot of sort of the debates and patterns during the interim period of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement from 2005 to 2011. So I think there are some parallels there to be made in terms of what happened at that time as well, of some rather limited reforms taking place, which then didn't really change the overall patterns of exercising power and governance in Sudan. What I would like to do now is to take maybe 15 minutes or so and to ask 3 questions to all the panelists before we open up for discussion. And some of the questions have already been touched upon during the presentation, so please draw out what you think can be added to what we've heard already. So the first one is, what are the biggest lessons of the Revolution for the Future of Human Rights in Sudan? How has it changed the landscape in terms of discourse and activism? So it's a question to all panelists. Who would like to go first?
Yeah, I think I can be less polite and take
Excellent.
first.
Thank you so much.
Great. I actually just basically, I think, will echo what Wala said, to be honest. I mean, just to add one example, I think the last point what I was making around how a lot of the efforts for the reform and accountability was really done outwardly than to Sudan, actually. You know, definitely a lot of these reforms, especially the one has to do with religious freedoms, has been done prior to Hamdok's visit to the US at the time when the Trump administration priority was religious freedom. it's not bad. That's the whole point. It's okay to do reforms. That's what we want to have at the end of the day. The question is how to make reforms in a sustainable, holistic manner, because injustice in Sudan is, it's political, but it touches upon so many elements. I mean, socio-economic elements, for instance. If we want to talk about, the reintegration of Sudan to international monetary, the IMF or the World Bank, it raises question about how much, research was done to the impact of the recipe provided by the IMF and the World Bank to social and economic rights. No one really did that, at least publicly, to be honest. So I think one of the main lessons learned is how to have this process in a holistic way, in an inclusive manner, and in a way that actually Sudanese dictate how much, this process should look like, and for the international donors to actually listen, and to be able to accommodate the historical needs of Sudan's hopeful incoming transition, and not to come with, the fixed recipe of ticking boxes and cosmetic surgeries, of legal reform and stuff. So I think it's quite broad, but I think it does touch upon one of the critical issues that we saw in the transition. And to be honest, the same mindset seems to be occupying the scene now. Bit more concerned that the attention, of course, is not much on Sudan, but when it's actually happening lately, it's really driven by the Russia-Ukraine. And I really hope this is not going to be the case. I have to be honest, and I said that a few times. Having a relationship with Russia is not the human rights abuse. The human rights abuses has been happening before. So we need to have a principled approach to Sudan's situation as it is now, not in relation to where Sudan stands in the international region geopolitics, because that's what happened. That's what al-Bashir did. He played pragmatically into the needs of the US and other, Western countries to get some sort of access and legitimacy, especially around counterterrorism and, the Khartoum process as a good example. So I think this is something I hope actors involved in Sudan would reflect on.
Right, thank you. I think you spoke primarily to sort of the politics, if you like, of human rights, which both Juan and you have covered quite extensively already in your presentations. So what I would be quite interested to hear from all of you is how, perhaps also in a positive way, but obviously you can be equally critical, when we look at the discourse and activism on human rights, because it has been quite a significant change. You had a number of, if you like, former human rights activists moving into sort of official roles. You had young actors coming to this scene. The emergency lawyers, new ways of engaging. You had perhaps also a greater focus on issues such as discrimination, rights for peace, and others. And obviously you have a very active human rights discourse also coming from these certain parts of the resistance committees. So there is a new, if you like, landscape there in terms of discourse and activism that is, of course, taking place in parallel to the broader politics of human rights, but also influences that. So I would be quite interested to hear your reflections on that. Maybe Mala would like to come in.
Sure, yeah. I'll start by saying that I think the main lesson is that there is no need to lower the bar for Sudan. Actually, the bar is really high when it comes to the, as we're saying, the movement. So I think at the political level, there is a lowering of the bar and the expectations of what can be done in Sudan, while on the other hand, you see that the only reason Sudan is not Egypt 2013 is because of the deep grassroots, neighborhood level organization of citizens that took the streets. Actually, I witnessed people on the streets less than an hour from the announcement of the military coup. And since then have been on the streets. We're approaching the first anniversary, or I hope the last anniversary of the military coup. And the Sudanese people have not, there hasn't been a day where there wasn't a protest or a strike, or other forms of mobilization on the street. And this created a deep commitment from large sectors of the society, if not for human rights broadly, it's for accountability. So putting accountability in the core and the center of any future political process, as well as organization, is key. And it's very important to allow for any peaceful process. And accountability has different layers, because accountability for someone in Khartoum is different than accountability, the meaning of accountability, to someone in Blue Nile or South Kordofan or Darfur. Um, so more focusing and a deeper look at the grassroots organization would make us understand the political landscape better, and the human rights movement better than focusing on the political elites, as well as the civil society elites.
All right, thank you. Marianne, do you want to come in? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of what you've said, and I think also that was the main tenet of my presentation as well, was that really the big missed opportunity to create processes that were inclusive, that would lead to the reforms that were necessary. For me, was really the big lesson learned. I think when you have this kind of division between the regions and Khartoum, it would have been a fantastic opportunity really to address the divisions, to address the discrimination, to really bring people to open up spaces for dialogue. So I think really process, trying to devise processes for engagement and public dialogue would have been a really big asset.
All right, thank you. And I think obviously point that well raised in particular, you as well earlier, is what the so-called transitional justice processes. So obviously there were some plans underway how to do that in the Sudanese context. Plenty of debate about, I think, the actual procedure, but that was then actually killed in its tracks as a result of the coup. So I think some of the lessons to be learned probably is also why there have been so many delays and how to have a better process in place in any future transition. So now the next question actually takes us a bit back to the politics, but with a more African focus and perhaps also a more specific institutional focus. How do you see the role of African political and human rights bodies, as well as civil society, in ensuring greater human rights protection in Sudan? And of course, if we look at that from a historical perspective, we had a lot of African civil society engagement, but also from human rights bodies early on Darfur. So I think it would be interesting for all of us to hear how you assess the current engagement, the potential for further engagement, and what you consider some of the shortcomings. And obviously, I think both Mohammed and Malala, you have already talked about the international engagement, but would you say that all of what you said applies in equal measure, or even more so, even to the relationship of Sudan with other African countries and perhaps other neighbors in the wider region. Was that a nod to Mohammed, or does that mean you want to speak, Wala? Okay, I think Mohammed, you're invited to take the floor.
I would try. I mean, I think one point, I mean, I think the relevancy of the African mechanism, for instance, came through the 2019 constitutional document, because it was the only non-Sudanese entity allowed to provide support to the Untitled Committee, which is, of course, was one of the main issues. When the bar of the demands at that time was for international engagement or international investigation or international support, that did not happen. And then I do believe in 2021, the former government, I think the head of the Untitled Committee said the AU declined to provide support. It wasn't very clear the reasons why. I think the assumption would be an issue of resources. But it's definitely Sudan, you know, and many people here know Sudan had a long legacy at the African Commission in terms of cases. And I think one of the recommendation suggestions we provided early, and hopefully maybe that would come in the future, is to actually have a domestic unit to, you know, follow the implementation of the cases from the African Commission. I mean, at the end of the day, there is pretty much not taking pretty little space of what could be done in the official way when we talk about African mechanism, since we have only the Commission access, which is at the end of the day, that speaks more to strategic litigation, but also to the possibility of the Commission to conduct fact-finding mission to Sudan. But, you know, most importantly, as you said, Professor Lutz, there is a history of engagement of African groups. And that really begs the point around solidarity. And I think the resistance committees had made clear as political groups that for the first, have to say probably for the first time in Sudan's history, when you have political actors, you know, who mobilize for protests, but they do have very clear human rights agenda. So they are actually, some of them playing the, you know, the role we see from the old civil society. So I think there would be a space of African civil society groups to do more in terms of engaging with the domestic actors in Sudan, in terms of pushing human rights agenda from a point of solidarity.
All right, Wala, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. I would just add one point about the African Commission. I think, especially looking at the time of the protests in 2018, 2019, and all the recommendations and the decisions that the Commission made on cases on Sudan, the Commission remains tight-handed. You know, it's extremely underfunded. So if we are to envision a larger role for the African Commission, because the AU as an entity could be very problematic in terms of, you know, different people have different opinions. This is where I would pause on this. But considering the positive role of the African Commission, mainly, I think it's really important to support the African Commission itself with resources to be able to be responsive. I do remember commissioners talking about the fact that fact-finding missions are difficult not only for political reasons, but also for financial reasons. Monitoring and responding to cases is slow because the commission is understaffed, you know. All these issues are really, really important to look at before assuming a role for namely the African Commission, or a broader role or a bigger role for the African Commission, which this has a solution, right? This is where international support comes in. So maybe fund the Commission to do more work on Sudan.
I'm afraid we're losing you. We lost you for a second there. We lost
the
you.
last sentence I was saying,
Yes.
the last thing I was saying is that maybe one of the ways to look at this is maybe to fund the commission to do for the international actors and legal actors to fund the commission to do more on Sudan, including fact-finding missions, recommendations, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Mariana.
Yeah, I don't know. We discussed this internally. When I was looking at these questions, and one of my colleagues said that perhaps also the civil society in Sudan perhaps didn't have those connections, say, with IGAD and different organizations in the region to make the lobbying that was necessary to make those entities more active. I think those, maybe those kind of connections and knowledge of those different regional bodies, particularly IGAD, for instance, just take time to develop. And I think, the transition period was relatively short. So maybe this is also a factor.
Right. So last one. And I really want to open this up for discussion. So if all of you could sharpen your minds, the panelists, and just answer this question in 1 or maximum 2 minutes. So that's a challenge. I appreciate that. But what do you see as the priorities for human rights protection and accountability should there be a peaceful political transition towards civilian rule? So in other words, probably if you were the ones to set the agenda and you had the chance in your first 100 days in office to bring about change and develop a strategy for human rights protection and accountability, what would that look like? Yeah, so we'll reverse the order. Mariana goes first now.
So I'd be really curious to know what Osman and Wala think of this, and perhaps to answer, I have a question. I always wondered why there was never a talk of a truth commission in the transition process, and I just thought, I'm a big fan of truth commissions. I've seen, for instance, the one in Sierra Leone. There was so much public debate. It created so much openness and discussion about the past. It was so inclusive. It engaged people from all the regions. I think, having a sort of reckoning and a space for dialogue would be a really big priority. So, I just throw that out there. Maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe part of the transitional justice discussions included a truth commission. But, obviously the accountability part is necessary. But I think there is a really big need for bringing dialogue and connecting different parts of the country to discuss the past and what reforms are necessary in an inclusive way.
All right, Wala, and then Mohammed will have the last word.
Yeah, Mariana, I will start by just answering from what I know about your question about the Truth Commission. I think that the vision was that the Transitional Justice Commission the role of the Transitional Justice Commission is to actually not to manage the transitional justice process, but to envision the transitional justice process. So I would assume that the thinking was, if seriously taken as an important milestone, that the Commission would actually engage on issues of truth and so on and so forth. And I think from what you said, I would set my what I think should be a priority, having reached a peaceful transition, is to actually have a broader justice and accountability policy that guides the reform process. Prioritizing this policy should also prioritize the infrastructure for human rights justice and accountability, meaning that the establishment of different commissions. This is a priority, you know, the establishment of the commissions, the standards which the establishment, you know, to follow certain standards, from the beginning, being consultative, transparent process. The transitional legislative council should come before the transitional civilian government. This is a human rights priority, actually, I would say. Thank you.
All right, Mohammed.
Yeah, I mean, just to avoid just ticking the boxes, of course, you know, institutional reform, legal reform, that all comes as a priority. I mean, just to also to your question, Mariana, as far as I know, the Juba Peace Agreement actually stipulates the form of reconciliation committee, like, you know, explicitly, not the Transitional Justice Commission, which was interesting to see how that would play with. So basically, you invented two commissions. I mean, none of them happened at the end of the day. But yeah, I mean, that's something that definitely would speak to the idea of, you know, not justice being done, but also being seen. That we saw it in different examples in terms of being televised, the outreach to different communities about the past atrocities. But I would definitely put having proper civilian oversight.
Now we've lost Mohammed, hopefully only for a second. We'll give you a moment.
By civilian, and that would change. And then the other thing I would like definitely to see proper enhancement and strengthening of witness protection programs in Sudan. And definitely there have been a lot of incidents around that in Khartoum, but also in Darfur in particular. So that's something I would put as a priority. And of course, immunities.
All right, thank you so much. That was really good follow-up discussion. We had already, I think, giving us plenty of food for thought for the discussion to come. So we have about half an hour left. So what I would like to do now is to take a few questions or comments from in here. If you could please say who you are first, and Ranes is monitoring the online chat in parallel, and I see there's already a question, so if you have further question, please send them. But who would like to start with any questions, comments, thoughts that cross your mind in here? Run, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Suzanne Jaspers. I'm a research associate here in SOAS. I was in, I mean, of course, I mean, I hear from all of you that it's a really long historical trajectory to what's happening in Sudan right now. But it seems to me one key difference is the role of social media that was brought up by Mariana in the first presentation. Yeah, I mean, social media, the role of public relations companies, and how kind of international state actors are involved in this. So, I mean, earlier this year, I was actually involved in a project on the role of digital technology, conflict, and famine. And there I looked at how hate speech can kind of intensify conflict, also the targeting of social media accounts of individual activists, but mostly actually into kind of shutting down networks, which of course occurred for about a month during the coup. Now, at the time, I was looking mostly at issues in relation to international humanitarian law and criminal law, and there's a kind of debate as to those acts constitute violations of those international laws. So I don't know if there's anything that the panelists can say about the role of human rights law in the use of social media to, like I said, intensify conflict or access to, the targeting of particular activists. And then I guess even more difficult is how you hold people or companies or international actors accountable. So that's, I think it's a big issue, but you may not be able to answer all of it.
Yeah. Mariana, do you want to go first? Because I think that's very much part and parcel of what you've been working on, and I think you're absolutely right, Susanna, that it raises some quite complex legal issues of all the areas of law you mentioned, and the interplay of them, and then also the enforcement. So over to you.
Yeah,
please.
thanks. It's a great question. I think it's a problem that is really, it's not specific to Sudan. It's something that, affects us here in the UK and in everywhere in terms of the use of social media in amplifying narratives that are already there. So I think also that's something that I think is important to mention, is that there's a lot of talk about social media and hate speech, but actually, we look at the genocides that we've had to date, when we had hate speech, in the Holocaust and in Rwanda and in Darfur and in all these places, and that was well before social media existed. So those narratives are there already, and it's just the amplification of them that is, an escalating and aggravating factor, and also the ease with which one can manipulate those narratives and feed in misinformation, which is also quite scary. But I think from a domestic human rights law perspective, it's a really difficult issue because, for instance, in Sudan, there were, in relation to the anti-discrimination law that was being discussed during the transition, there was also discussion about an anti-hate speech law that would be part of that or not. But actually, that is often very problematic, because those kinds of laws tend to repress free speech in a way that is even more dangerous than the hate speech element in and of itself. So I think that I wouldn't really recommend new laws to deal with hate speech specifically. I think looking at anti-discrimination generally and hate crime generally, or violence that is motivated by identity would be something to look at in the first place. And in terms of the regulation at an international level, I think more awareness is needed for local groups to be able to report things online. So that's some of the training that we've done with just local activists, in some of the conflict regions, in terms of understanding how how do you report on Facebook, that there is a misuse or a breach. So though these Facebook and others have got systems, they're not perfect, but we can learn how to use them better, the kind of internal mechanisms that go with those companies. But yeah, it's a whole big area that many others are also looking at globally.
Yeah, just to say, because I'm doing some research now on digital torture, and again, it's something that looks at what is unique about using social media, I think, as an instrument to violate rights, so either directly or calling on people to violate rights. So I think that is perhaps the bigger question then, because I think, Mariana, you're absolutely right that a lot of the patterns are already there, but that social media plays a very unique role and has specific features that make its regulation quite challenging. I can see that Mohammed is back. Wala is also there. Would one of you want to comment on this point, on the role of social media and human rights law in Sudan?
Yeah, I think just quickly 2 points. I think the use of social media in the positive way around the mobilization, it speaks to the nature of the resistance committees per se, as no longer new political actors, but introducing new trends around activism and political mobilization. But on the other hand, as something I'm working on recently around atrocities in Darfur, we are seeing an increasing use of social media around documentation of abuses by the perpetrators themselves. We're seeing a lot of videos from attackers in certain places in Darfur. We're seeing a massive use around TikTok, for instance, by some members of the Rapid Support Forces and Arab leaders, We are seeing a growing of hate speech also going around through these platforms on Clubhouse. So it's an interesting observation in terms of also having, you know, quote unquote, the bad guys also using social media in that way, which is, you know, for people who are using using open source investigation, that could come handy in terms of human rights research.
Yeah, I think very important point you make. Obviously, it's a double-edged sword, so to speak, social media, when we talk about human rights in Sudan. Certainly also on documentation, I think plays a very important role. Well, is there anything to add from you on that point?
Nothing in particular. I'll just add one thing, just another review or another look at what happened during the transitional period in terms of in relation to the cyberspace or the online space, which was the amendments that were done on the Cybercrime Act, which is mainly increase the incarceration time for almost all, not all, but majority of the articles or the crimes, without looking at the question of freedom of expression. And the cybercrime law was actually one of the tools that were used against, you know, activists and critics of the government. So mainly you would see that a crime that was punished by 5 years became 10 years. Those were punished by 10 became 15. Those were punished by 15 became life. So this is the main change that took place with regard to the online sphere during the transition period. But I totally agree also with what Mohammed said in terms of the change of the landscape and the use of increasing use of social media recently in Sudan.
All right, thank you all. Any further questions on what's been discussed, human rights, accountability, justice in Sudan? Also from those who've just joined us, you want to share your thoughts? Now would be the moment. No? Yes. The discussion has really been around sort of the development of the human rights situation currently and what the challenges are and what the options are for human rights protection and accountability. And I think maybe, and I will put you on the spot now because it's great to have you here. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about the role of the health professionals in Sudan during the transition and the challenges they've faced, and what you would say is a distinctive contribution of health professionals. I know you're not on the panel, but now that we have you here, coming from Sudan, I think would be great. And if you could kindly introduce yourself as well, unless you want to do it anonymously, that's also fine.
Hello, everyone. I'm Amal Sidahmat. I arrived from Sudan 2 days ago, where I live and work. I'm a consultant psychiatrist and human rights defender. I'm not prepared for this, but I will try to reflect the situation you said during transition, Lutz.
Yes.
Okay, health situation. Historically, the health system in Sudan is based on primary health care system. It's a wide country, big country, and most of it is more than 75% is rural areas, which recently, or not recently, but the last few years, early 90s becomes deprived of any kind of basic services, including healthy water. So when we, at the transition, we inherited a collapsed health system. And the growth of the private health sector was dramatic, very expensive in cities, and dominating as a service for who afford it. So the health professionals unions who participated significantly during the revolution and still up to now, we proposed our vision, which we have been working on for many years, is that the most important is to rehab and look for a new health system that will be suitable for most of the people in Sudan. Because also there is new factors, not like before '89, which is the war, the famine, the environmental factors, in particular in relation to the minerals, petrol and gold. So it has massive effect on rural people in these areas. And unfortunately, the transitional government, maybe the Federal Ministry of Health is the one of the main ministries that there has been clear division of opinion between privatization and which model to use. And maybe some of you has heard of Dr. Akram, who's pro-revolution first health minister, who proposed that the focus of the government should be on the public health sector. And the focus also on rural areas and war zones. Unfortunately, he has been kicked out of the cabinet by Mr. Hamdok, and we continued in the same dilemma of health. Now, health for those who have got the money to buy it from the private sector. And there is scattered services in some where there is disasters run by regional and international NGOs, which is like a drop in the ocean because it's a huge number of people. And now we face the famine for the second time in the last 20 years. My specialty is mental health. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. And the issue is general mental health services. Generally, the health service is fragmented. It's not only poor, but also fragmented. Even within the public sector is fragmented. So now we have tens of thousands of traumatized people in the war zones and protesters, you know what is happening, who face guns, tear gas, and violence every day in every part of Sudan, and we struggle to offer service for them. On the positive side, I'm sorry for starting with the negative side, the gloomy side. Still, lots of doctors and health professionals, we are working on how to get the health issues to the front of the agenda in the new transitional government and for the revolution itself. So that is a big issue. high maternal mortality rate, high infant mortality rate, and malnutrition. And but I'm sorry, I don't have figures to say now, but I can say even the government documents on health, they are not correct. But even if we take that as the official figures, it reflects poor health situation in Sudan, and there is no quick fix for this, but it is part of the struggle of people of Sudan. It's health and education. This is what I can say now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad that I put you on the spot there, because I think the issue of the right to health is often overlooked, I think, in broader debates. And obviously it's become even more pronounced and in the current circumstances for the reasons you mentioned. And I think also the contribution of health professionals during the current crisis is immense. And you talk about obviously working on mental health, but it's obviously also for anyone in the health service, work in the health service in Sudan must be a tremendous, really sort of mental health challenge for all of you, as we know, working under such circumstances. So we have a few questions here. So we have a question from Aliaja to Mariana. Thank you for the interesting presentation on the impact of social media. Did you look at the coverage of the internet and the internet in Sudan? I think that will make the picture clearer. I think that is more of a comment. Then, when we talk about accountability and transitional justice in the Sudanese context, to what extent is it possible to achieve a level of accountability that would meet the demands and aspirations of the Sudanese people? Considering the vast challenges such as perpetrators holding crucial positions within the current coup government, the different demands of victims between truth and retributive justice, and the dire economic situation. So I think that maybe is a question we could take, because I think that comes back to the issue of truth and accountability, and how that can be achieved. And obviously here's looking even at the meeting the demands and aspirations of the Sudanese people is, of course, one of the first questions is how do we determine what these are? What is the appropriate process for that, and what should justice look like in the circumstance, and what should be adequate forms of reparation for victims? And given that we only have a few minutes left, I would say that we take this as the last question. Who would like to start? Yeah, Mariana is happy to start.
So if I understood correctly the question, in terms of who is to determine the priorities, is that really what the question was about?
Yeah, and what
should the process be?
Not only what the process should be, but how is it possible to achieve a level of accountability, considering the vast challenges such as perpetrators holding crucial positions within the current government, different demands of victims between truth and retributive justice, and the dire economic situation? So basically, I think the point is that any such process invariably risks falling short of the demands and aspirations of the Sudanese people.
Yeah, I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day, as we say. So I think it'll take a lot of different, different building blocks to get to build a house again. But I think I would just like to come back to this idea of an inclusive process. I think it is all well and good to have a top-down priorities in terms of what needs to be done as the first priority. But I actually think that unless we start with a bottom-up approach where people feel included from all over the country into what the priorities should be, I think we will continue to have this division between the centers and the peripheries, and the conflict regions will continue to feel discriminated against and marginalized, etc. So I think from my point of view, I think that is just something I can't emphasize enough, is that if we can start, whether it's a truth commission or a national dialogue process, but truth commissions have the advantage of producing recommendations, and also reparations recommendations, which again would point to the priorities of the health sector reform, and the, reparations will invariably include mental health provision for all the war affected and pro-democracy movement affected people, as well as medical provision, economic support, etc. So I think that would be, for me, the starting point is like, we need to have a different model, bottom-up one, that is inclusive to start with, and then all the experts can come in and say how to do it. But I think if people don't feel included, it would just create that constant feeling of marginalization.
All right, thank you, Mariana. So now it's the question, who wants to have the last word? So maybe we'll give the last word to Wala. That means, Mohammed, it's over to you now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a question that lawyers may not, which is a bit funny to say, but lawyers may not be the best people to answer that question, because we do have our also benchmarks and ideals about processes. Definitely, it's at the end of the day, especially in Sudan context, it's also a political question. When you have perpetrators who are on, basically wielding massive amount of power, in addition to all this economic, plutocratic interest, the question is, what will be the incentive or the sanction for them to accept such process? And I don't think I have an answer for it. Definitely at the end of the day, as Mariana mentioned, I think processes like truth and reconciliation that be able to produce recommendations where the political authorities are actually willing to enforce them and donors are backing such process could be a start somewhere. I mean, at the end of the day, in the history of post-independent Sudan, this is, I don't want to say it's nothing, but it's definitely not that long in terms of the many trial and error. And hopefully there will be a transition that would allow a trial and error process to take place, in which at least we can have a starting point somewhere, whether it's in terms of criminal justice or in terms of other forms of transitional justice.
All right, thank you. I can't see Wala on the screen, so we may have lost her at the vital last moment, which means that you actually had the last word in the panel discussion. So a big thank you to all of the three of you. I'll have to convey it to Wala in a different format, but thank you, Mohammed, thank you, Mariana. That was a brilliant discussion and a wide-ranging one, and obviously an ongoing one, because even in 2 hours you can only touch upon some of the many issues which have engaged many people for months, if not years on end. So that intellectual and actually activist struggle for protection and accountability certainly will continue for quite some time to come. Thank you all for joining us online and obviously also in person. And for those of you who've joined us in person, a special treat is waiting, and I'll hand back to Rana to say a bit more about that.
Just drinks. No need for a mic, but just drinks. But do join us again on 5th of October online this time. I'll send an email around for all the registrants. For another